There are villages where a ferry is only a boat, and there are villages where it is a promise. Lochdoo's ferry was a small, weather-beaten thing, often late, often damp, and sometimes spoken to by its ferryman as if it were a stubborn auntie. But it crossed the Loch when the road round was flooded, when messages had to be carried, when shopping bags were too heavy, and when pride required that Lochdoo not be treated as the forgotten end of a council map. Then a visitor arrived, with a clipboard, a clean coat, and the power to decide whether the ferry still mattered. In Lochdoo, even the weather can't stop gossip, but one missing ferry might. Settle in by the fire, and come down to the slip, where the timetable is crooked, the tea is stewed, and Hamish Macbeth is already wet through. Chapter 1. The Timetable on the Nail. By 8 o'clock in the morning, the ferry timetable had come loose at one corner again. It hung from the notice board of the tin-roofed waiting shelter by 3 drawing pins and a nail that someone had hammered in during a storm 10 years before, and which everyone now spoke of as if it were council property. The paper was laminated, but not well. Moisture had crept in along the edges, turning the corners cloudy and soft. Someone had written subject to weather in blue pen underneath the printed Times, and someone else, in a meaner hand, had added, "and Cal's mood." Hamish Macbeth stood beneath it with rain running from the brim of his cap, and considered the indignity of being a police constable without a police car. His Land Rover was in Strathbane for repairs, which meant it was either being repaired, ignored, or slowly cannibalized for parts, while someone in overalls drank tea and blamed paperwork. Until it returned, Hamish had been walking, borrowing lifts, and discovering that a man could look official in a uniform and ridiculous at the same time if his socks were wet enough. Lugs, his dog, had reached a firmer conclusion. He had sat down in the shelter doorway and refused to move. "Come on, you great lump," said Hamish mildly. Lugs blinked up at him with the settled patience of an animal prepared to wait out civilization. The morning har lifted in ragged strips from the loch. Beyond the slip, the ferry lay against the pier, dark and blunt-nosed, its paint scuffed by years of rope, weather, and men who had opinions about both. Gulls quarrelled on the railings. The air smelled of diesel, seaweed, wet rope, and the strong tea Cal Mackay kept in a flask with a tartan sleeve gone bald at the corners. There was already a small queue. Mrs. Wellington stood with 2 shopping bags, and an expression of Christian disapproval aimed at the sky. Archie McLean, the fisherman, had a coil of line over one shoulder and the sort of face that suggested he had seen worse weather before breakfast. The Curry sisters, Nessie and Jessie, were pretending not to look at the young mother with the pram, whose baby had begun to object to being born into a country with ferries. "Nessie," whispered Jessie, "is it late?" "It is not late yet," said Nessie. "It is becoming late. That's worse. It often is." At the edge of the slip, Cal Mackay emerged from the ferry's little wheelhouse, wiping his hands on a rag. He was a square, weather-dark man, with silver hair flattened under a wool cap and a face that looked permanently braced against spray. He had been ferryman long enough for people to blame him for tides. "She's just needing a minute," he called. "The boat or Mrs. Wellington?" asked Archie. "The engine," said Cal. "Mrs. Wellington's beyond my qualifications." Mrs. Wellington sniffed, but not with real offence. Lochdoo had long ago made peace with insults that proved one belonged. Hamish stepped out of the shelter and felt rain find the back of his neck. "Morning, Cal." "Hamish. You're walking?" "Ah, yeah." "Car still away?" "Ah, yeah. Bad thing. A man without his wheels." "It's character building," said Hamish. "You've character enough." Lugs, who had not moved from the shelter doorway, gave a heavy sigh and sprawled like an old hearth rug, blocking half the entrance. The young mother lifted the pram wheels round him. "Missis." Wellington stepped over him with a grunt. Archie scratched him behind one ear. "Lazy brute," said Archie. Lugs accepted this tribute. Cal came up the slip with his ticket pouch. The ferry had no elegant system. There was a roll of tickets, a wooden box for coins, and a metal punch shaped like a thistle, bought years before by a ferry trust committee that had briefly believed in branding. Cal took each ticket, pinched it between thick fingers, and punched a small thistle-shaped hole near the corner. Click, click, click. A wee boy in a green anorak, who had come down with his grandmother only to see the ferry leave, held out both hands. "Can I have the stubs, Mr. Mackay?" "They're not treasure, Ewan. They are if you collect them." Cal tore off the punched ends and dropped them into the boy's palm. Ewan examined them with the solemnity of a jeweller. Hamish watched Cal punch his own ticket. The punch had always amused him. Its thistle shape was more ambitious than practical, and one of the little petals had bent inward, so that each hole it made carried a tiny, uneven notch. Not enough for most folk to notice. Just enough to make every punched ticket look faintly imperfect. "Your thistle's still lame," said Hamish. Cal glanced at it. "Like half this village, it works fine if nobody pokes it." A fair description of Lochdoo. "You'll be wanting that on the council sign?" Before Hamish could answer, a car appeared at the top of the lane. It was not a local car. Local cars came down to the ferry slip apologetically, as if asking permission from the potholes. This one descended with controlled impatience, silver and clean in a way that looked accusatory. It stopped near the shelter. The driver's door opened. A woman stepped out. She wore a dark, waterproof coat that had never been used for anything foolish. Her hair was pinned back in a smooth knot. She carried a leather folder against her chest and looked first at the ferry, then at the queue, then at the timetable hanging crooked under the shelter roof. No one spoke. That was how Lochdoo greeted strangers who might matter. The woman crossed to the notice board. She studied the timetable, then the handwritten additions beneath it. Her mouth tightened, not enough to be rude, only enough to be remembered. "Mr. Mackay?" she said. Cal straightened. "Aye." Meredith Slate. "Council Transport Review." The word review passed along the queue like a draft. Mrs. Wellington adjusted her bags. Jessie Curry whispered, "Review," as if it were a disease. Nessie said nothing, which was worse. Meredith Slate held out her hand. Cal wiped his palm again before shaking it. "I wrote to the Ferry Trust," she said. "I'll be observing operations today." "So I heard." "I was told the 8 o'clock crossing was reliable." Cal looked at the Loch, then at the ferry, then back at her. "You were told by someone indoors." A corner of Meredith's mouth moved. It might have been amusement, or a note being made in her head. Hamish stepped forward. "Hamish Macbeth, police." Her eyes took him in. The wet cap, the wet shoulders, the dog in the doorway, the absence of anything resembling a car. "Constable," she said. "Do you travel on this ferry often?" "When my car is held hostage." "By whom?" "Strathbane mechanics." "I see." She did not see, but she had the brisk good manners of someone who had learned not to waste disbelief. Cal began ushering people towards the gangplank. The ferry engine coughed, shuddered, then settled into a low, uneven thrum. Archie went first. Mrs. Wellington followed. The Currys stepped aboard together, though Jessie hesitated at the gap, and Nessie said, "For heaven's sake, Jessie, it is a ferry, not an elopement." Meredith Slate paused beside Hamish, as Cal punched another ticket. Click! Her eyes flicked to the punch. "That's rather distinctive." "Trust bought it," said Cal. "Back when we had money for foolishness." "May I see?" Cal handed it over reluctantly. Meredith turned it in her gloved hand. "A thistle." "Aye. In case passengers forget Scotland in the 3 minutes between buying a ticket and sitting down." Hamish smiled. Meredith did not. She pressed the punch experimentally on an old scrap of ticket and inspected the result. Her brow dipped slightly at the bent petal notch. "Does anyone else use this?" "No." "Where is it kept?" "In the trust room." "And who has access?" Cal took the punch back. "The folk that need access." Meredith wrote something in her folder. The queue watched her write. "There are few sounds more offensive to a small village than a pen recording it." When everyone had boarded, Hamish turned to Lugs. "Come on." Lugs looked at the gangplank. The gangplank looked at Lugs. Lugs planted himself more firmly. "He'll be wanting carried," said Archie from the deck. "He'll be wanting forgotten," said Hamish. But Lugs would not move. 2 people laughed. Mrs. Wellington tried not to. The baby in the pram stopped crying, intrigued by a creature larger and more stubborn than himself. Meredith Slate glanced down. "Is the dog always permitted aboard?" "He's permitted everywhere," said Hamish. "Whether invited or not. That may not meet safety guidance." "Neither does half of marriage," said Archie. This time even Cal laughed. Meredith wrote nothing, which was perhaps more dangerous. At last, Hamish coaxed lugs with a heel of oatcake from his pocket. The dog rose with deep reluctance and stepped onto the gangplank as if entering negotiations with death. The ferry shifted underfoot. Meredith Slate gripped the rail, just for a moment, Hamish noticed. Noted, rather than judged. People showed themselves in small corrections. The crossing began. The ferry moved out into the grey morning, leaving a weak churn behind it. Lochdoo watched from shore. White cottages, slate roofs, smoke from one chimney flattened by damp air. It looked less like a place on a map than an argument against being left out. On deck, the passengers settled into the old habits of the crossing. Archie stood near the stern. Mrs. Wellington opened one shopping bag to check the contents of another. Nessie Curry watched Meredith Slate, as if expecting her to remove a measuring tape. Jessie watched, Nessie watching. Hamish leaned against the rail. Lugs lay at his boots, wet and offended. Meredith moved along the deck, counting passengers, glancing at the safety ring, the notice about life jackets, the little peeling sign asking people not to stand forward of the yellow line that had faded to the colour of old butter. She stopped beside Hamish. "This service is important to the village?" "It is. Important enough to use?" "Meaning?" "Usage figures are not sentiment, Constable." "No," said Hamish. "But sentiment is sometimes why usage figures exist." She looked at him directly then, and for a second he saw something behind the crisp manner. Weariness, perhaps. Or a woman who had been sent to measure things that could not be weighed without damaging them. "I don't close services for pleasure," she said. "I'm sure. No one ever believes that." "No," said Hamish. "We prefer villains. They're tidier." The ferry bumped against the far slip. Cal tied up. The chain gate beyond the landing stood locked open against a post, its padlock hanging from a loop of metal. Beyond it, the narrow lane climbed towards the lochside lodge, where polished windows caught the morning light and gave it back coldly. Meredith Slate looked at the gate. "Who has the key to that?" Cal's jaw shifted. "I do." "Only you?" "There's spares." "Where?" "In Sensible Place." Her pen came out again. Hamish watched the little notebook open. The rain softened to a mist. Across the loch, Lochdoo's cottages blurred. On the deck, Ewan held his punch stubs up to the light. "Look," he said to his grandmother. "They've all got the same wee nick." "Aye," she said. "Like folk. All damaged in the same place if you look close enough." Hamish glanced at Meredith Slate. She had heard it. Her face did not change, but she wrote one more line before stepping ashore. Chapter 2. A report that feels like an insult. By noon the rain had settled into the kind that did not fall so much as inhabit the air. The lochside lodge stood beyond the far slip on a low rise where the road curved through wind-bent birches. It had once been a private house, then a fishing hotel, then a country retreat, then, after a great deal of money and not much tenderness, a heritage hospitality experience. Its public lounge had polished wood floors, tartan throws folded over leather chairs, framed prints of stags, and a smell of peat smoke that came from expensive candles rather than any honest fire. Alistair Drummond liked to say he had saved it. This was true, if saving a place meant giving it a logo and charging Londoners for silence. He came towards Meredith Slate with both hands extended, a tall man in a green tweed jacket that had been cut to suggest country life without risking mud. His hair was silver at the temples, his shoes were dark brown and polished, and he wore aftershave strong enough to make the air feel recently purchased. "Miss Slate, welcome. Alistair Drummond. We spoke by telephone." "Yes. Thank you for making the lounge available." "Nonsense. Anything for the community." From the sofa, nearest the window, Nessie Curry gave Jessie a look that said, "Mark that down." Several locals had been persuaded, summoned or frightened into attending Meredith's informal interviews. Myrie Gunn, chair of the Ferry Trust, sat at a small round table with her handbag on her knees and a stack of ferry accounts beside her. She was a narrow woman with tidy hands, tired eyes, and a cardigan buttoned as carefully as a legal argument. Cal Mackay stood near the door as if ready to escape back to weather. Robbie McPhee, the teenage deckhand, hovered by the sideboard where the coffee urn hissed. Hamish had come because Meredith had asked for local context, and because walking back to Lochdoo in the rain had seemed like a punishment out of proportion to his sins. Lugs lay beneath a table, slowly steaming. Alistair gestured to the window. Below, the ferry slip looked small and functional, the waiting shelter hunched against the rain. "You see the challenge," he said. "A charming service, yes, much loved. But love is not a maintenance plan." Meredith sat, opened her folder, and uncapped her pen. "I'm here to observe, not to prejudge." "Of course," said Alistair, in the tone of a man inviting her to prejudge correctly. Myrie Gunn's fingers tightened on her handbag. "The ferries run for decades. So have several unsafe bridges," said Meredith. "Longevity is not evidence." Robbie snorted. Cal turned his head. "Robbie, what?" "It's what she means." Meredith looked at the boy. He was 17, long-limbed, red-haired, and raw, with a kind of pride that had not yet learned how expensive pride could be. "What I mean," she said, "is that public money requires justification." "Public money always requires us to bow and scrape," said Robbie. "Robbie," Myrie said, quieter than Cal but sharper. The boy flushed and looked away. Alistair gave a sympathetic sigh. "You must forgive the young. They feel criticism as attack." Hamish watched Robbie's shoulders climb. There were several kinds of insult in the room. Meredith's was official and perhaps unintended. Alistair's was smooth and deliberate. Robbie's was clumsy enough to be blamed. Myrie leaned forward. "We have figures. Passenger counts, essential crossings, medical appointments, deliveries when the road's washed?" "Yes," said Meredith. "I'll review them. You'll find we make do." "That phrase has appeared in several submissions," Meredith said. "It interests me." "Why?" "Because making do can mean resilience. It can also mean informal procedures no one wants recorded." Myrie's cheeks coloured. Cal said, "We get folk across." "With what controls?" "With eyes," said Cal. "And sense. Those are not controls, Mr. Mackay. They're better than some forms." Meredith made a note. The pen scratched. In the lounge, that small sound had the force of an accusation. Alistair moved to the coffee urn. "I do wonder," he said lightly, "whether the village would not benefit from a more modern arrangement. A properly managed private launch, perhaps, booked crossings, better safety, less burden on council funds." Nessie Curry's eyes narrowed. Jessie whispered, "Private launch?" "Hoosh." Meredith looked up. "Operated by whom?" "I've made no formal proposal," said Alistair, pouring coffee. "But the lodge has resources. Staff, insurance, a guest launch already, though of course we keep it separate from public use." "Very generous," said Hamish. Alistair turned with the cup. "Constable? Offering to take a burden off the public purse." "It is practical." "Aye. Practical things often wear nice shoes." For the first time, Alistair's smile thinned. Meredith accepted the coffee, but did not drink it. "I'll need to inspect the far slip this evening," she said. "The chain gate, the shelter, the lighting, and access arrangements." Cal frowned. "There's no late crossing." "I didn't ask for one. It'll be foggy by evening." "All the more reason," Myrie said. "You should have someone with you." "I'm quite capable of looking at a gate." "It's not the gate," said Cal. "It's the Loch. Folk who don't know it think still water means safe ground." "Thank you. I'll bear that in mind." Her politeness was a shut door. Hamish noticed Alistair watching her. Not admiringly, not irritably. measuring, as though Meredith were not a person but a document he wished he could read upside down. Robbie muttered, "She'll recommend closure anyway." Meredith heard him. "I recommend, according to evidence." "Aye, and you'll find the evidence you were sent to find." "Robbie," said Myrie again, but the boy had gone too far to stop gracefully. "You come here with your wee folder and look at us like we're all cheating you. Maybe we should just save your time and sink the ferry ourselves." Silence took the room. Alistair set down the coffee pot with a soft click. Meredith closed her folder. "If you are employed by the Ferry Trust, Mr. McPhee, I would advise you not to joke about sabotage." Robbie's face went bright red. "I wasn't." "No," she said. "You probably weren't." Somehow that was worse. Lugs rose under the table, shook himself violently, and sent a spray of damp across Alistair's polished shoes. "Good dog," said Archie McLean from the doorway, where he had appeared unnoticed with a basket of smoked fish for the lodge kitchen. Alistair looked down at the drops on his shoes. "Perhaps," he said, still smiling, "we could all remember that the question is not whether Lochdoo feels fondly towards the ferry. It is whether the ferry is viable." The word landed badly. Lochdoo did not like being told it had feelings instead of arguments. It liked even less the suggestion that it might be weighed and found wanting. Myrie's voice came out very quiet. "People live here, Mr. Drummond. We are not a business unit." "No one said you were." "You nearly did." Hamish looked at her. There was a tremble in her hand now, quickly hidden beneath the ferry accounts. Meredith saw it too. Her expression softened barely. "I understand the concern," she said. "But if the service is to continue, it needs clear records, safe access, accurate reporting, and no unlogged crossings." Cal stiffened. "There are no unlogged crossings." "I hope that is true." Again the pen scratched. Outside, rain ran down the big windows. The ferry's mast light showed faintly through the grey, a dull bead at the slip. Hamish thought of the bent petal on the ticket punch. A tiny flaw repeated over and over, unnoticed because everyone knew what the ticket meant. Belonging. Payment. Permission to cross. Meredith's slate turned a page. "Now," she said, "about the padlocked chain gate at the far slip. Who holds keys?" Everyone looked at Cal. Cal looked at Myrie. Myrie looked at the accounts. Alistair Drummond smiled into his coffee. And Hamish, wet-footed and carless, began to feel that the ferry was not the only thing in Lochdoo running on arrangements no one wanted written down. Chapter 3. The Late Crossing. That evening the Red Lion was doing what Highland pubs do best in bad weather, pretending to be casual while serving as court, parliament, confessional, weather station and public theatre. A peat fire burned low in the grate. The windows were black mirrors streaked with rain. Wet boots lined the hearth. Someone had brought in a sack of turnips and left them by the door, where they gave the impression of a defeated congregation. The soup was lentil, thick enough to stand a spoon in if the spoon had ambition. Hamish sat at the end of the bar with a bowl of it, his damp cap beside him and lugs stretched under his stool like a rug that had lost hope. The dog had spent much of the day refusing gangplanks, accepting biscuits, and giving Meredith Slate the long, tragic stare he reserved for people who wrote things down. Meredith herself sat at a small table near the window, alone, with half a bowl of soup cooling beside her and her folder open. People kept glancing at her, then away, then back again with improved excuses. The Curry sisters occupied their usual corner. "She writes while eating," Jessie whispered. "That is not eating," said Nessie. "That is refuelling. She has a very straight back." "People with straight backs close libraries." At another table, Robbie McPhee sat with two lads his age, not drinking much and talking too loudly. His mother, Fiona, worked evenings at the lodge laundry, and everyone in Lochdoo knew Robbie's wages from the ferry went into the household pot. This made his anger understandable, which did not make it safe. Cal Mackay stood near the bar, nursing a whisky he had not earned time to drink. Myrie Gunn sat across from him, the ferry accounts in a cloth bag at her feet, as if she feared they might escape and shame her. Alistair Drummond came in at 8:30. He brought with him the scent of expensive aftershave and damp tweed. The pub shifted around him. Not much. Just enough. Men who owed the lodge seasonal work nodded. Women whose nieces cleaned rooms there looked down at their drinks. He greeted everyone warmly, which was to say, he greeted everyone in a manner that reminded them he could afford warmth. "Dreadful night," he said. "It's Scotland," said Archie MacLean. "We try not to take it personally." Alistair laughed, as if Archie had been charming rather than accurate. He crossed to Meredith's table. "Miss Slate. Working still? Reviewing notes? Admirable. Though I hope Lochdoo has not been too exhausting." "It has been informative." "I found that often means exhausting." This time Meredith smiled slightly. Hamish watched from the bar. Alistair leaned closer, lowering his voice, but not enough for a pub trained in hearing things. "If you need anything from the lodge tonight, do call. I understand you plan to inspect the far slip." "I do. In this weather, visibility matters in poor conditions. So does caution. I'll be cautious." Cal pushed away from the bar. "There's no crossing scheduled now." Meredith looked up. "I know. The far slips across the Loch. I have a car. The lane round is rough in fog. Then your access issues are wider than the ferry." Cal's face hardened. Robbie laughed. A sharp sound without humour. "She's got you there, Cal." "Hold your tongue," said Cal. "Why? Everyone else gets to talk about whether we deserve a boat." Fiona McPhee had come in quietly to collect a parcel from the bar. She was a thin woman, with red hair darker than Robbie's and hands roughened by laundry work. At her son's tone, she stopped. "Robbie." He turned, saw her, and shame crossed his face like a cloud over water. "I'm saying what folk think. Folk think plenty foolish things. They needn't all come out of your mouth." There was kindness in the room then, embarrassed and brief. The sort that appears when a mother corrects a son in public and everyone remembers being either mother or son. Meredith closed her folder and stood. "Thank you for the soup. It wasn't a compliment to the kitchen leaving half," said the landlord, with mock injury. "I'm sure it was excellent. I was distracted." "Aye. We do that to people." She put on her coat. Hamish said, "You're not going to the far slip now?" "Only to look at the lighting from the road. It'll be fog." "So Mr. Mackay has mentioned." "Repeatedly," said Cal. Meredith tucked the folder under her arm. "I'll be back at the lodge within the hour." Alistair stood. "I can have someone drive you." "No, thank you." "Then take a torch at least." "I have one." She moved towards the door. As she passed Hamish, he saw a small crease between her brows. Irritation, perhaps. Or unease she refused to dignify. At the door, she turned back. "Mr. Mackay, the far slip chain gate. It's locked at night?" "Aye. Aye. And the shelter?" "Open, in case anyone's caught in weather." "Thank you." She stepped out. The door opened long enough to let in a cold gust and the wet smell of the road. Then it shut, and the pub seemed to breathe again. Robbie said, too loudly, "She can't order the Loch about." Nessie Curry leaned towards Jessie. "That boy's mouth will be the making of trouble." Jessie nodded. "Or the remembering of it." Hamish finished his soup. It had too much pepper, which improved it. Alistair took Meredith's empty table and ordered a whisky. He did not look after her. He looked at the folder-shaped absence she had left on the table, as if her notes still occupied the air. Hamish rose. "Leaving us, Hamish?" asked the landlord. "Aye. I've a dog to disappoint." Lugs opened one eye and closed it again. Outside, the rain had eased, but fog had come down thick over the loch. The village lights were blurred yellow beads. Beyond the pub, the lane sloped towards the ferry slip, where the timetable in the shelter flapped softly at its loose corner. Hamish stood in the doorway a moment, letting his eyes adjust. From somewhere down by the water came a faint metallic sound. Not loud. A rattle, then a stop. The sort of sound a chain gate might make if handled by someone who wanted it quiet and failed. Hamish listened. The wind moved. A gull cried. Behind him the pub rose in laughter at something Archie had said. The rattle did not come again. Lugs pressed his wet nose against Hamish's leg, urging either action or supper. With Lugs, one could never be sure. Hamish walked down towards the slip. By the time he reached it, the fog had thickened. The ferry was tied up, dark and still. The chain at the near side hung where it should. The shelter smelled of damp wool and diesel. No one stood there. Across the loch, nothing could be seen. Hamish waited, rain ticking from the shelter roof. After a while, he heard footsteps on the road behind him. Cal Mackay appeared out of the fog. "You heard it too?" said Hamish. Cal's face was a pale blur under his cap. "Heard what?" "Chain." Cal looked at the ferry, then the water. "Wind does things." "Aye," said Hamish. "So do people." Cal said nothing. From the pub, Robbie's voice carried briefly, bright with forced laughter. Then the door closed and cut it off. Hamish looked at Cal. "You'll not be running any late crossings?" "No." "Sure?" Cal's eyes met his. "I said no." It was the sort of answer that sounded truthful and defensive at the same time. Hamish let it pass. He had learned that pushing too early made folk tidy their lies. He turned back towards the village. Lugs followed, stopping once to sniff at a muddy patch near the shelter post. "What is it?" Lugs sniffed again, sneezed, and lost interest. Hamish looked down. In the mud was a small, curved mark, half filled with rainwater, as if something metal had been dragged and lifted. He could not tell if it was new. The fog folded over the slip. Behind him, the ferry bumped softly against its ropes. Chapter 4. The Far Slip. At dawn, the loch had gone the colour of old pewter. Hamish had slept badly in a cottage that smelled of damp socks, dog, and the faint electrical fear of a heater threatening to give up. His first act of the morning had been to step into a cold puddle, left by a leak near the back door. His second had been to inform Lugs that one day he would own a dog with useful instincts. Lugs, sprawled like an old hearth-rug beside the stove, had received this without concern. The call came at 7, not a proper call, at first. 3 rings, then Mrs. Wellington's voice in a pitch that tried for control and missed. "Hamish, you'd better come to the ferry." "Near slip?" "No." The other. "Cal's gone across with Archie. There's something wrong." His carless state announced itself like a curse. Hamish borrowed a lift from Angela Brodie, who appeared with a coat over her nightdress, a basket of scones on the back seat, and an expression of practical alarm. "Doctor's already away ahead," she said. "I made scones. For the dead or the living?" "I don't know yet. That's why I made both kinds." "There are kinds?" "These ones are less burnt." Lugs climbed into the car with the entitlement of a laird. Hamish folded himself beside him, knees damp, cap dripping, dignity absent. The road round to the far slip was rough, narrow, and deeply pleased with itself. Rain blew sideways across the windscreen. Angela drove as if bullying the landscape into cooperating. When they reached the far slip, the ferry was already tied there. Cal stood near the gangplank, face grey. Archie McLean was beside him, hat in hand. Dr. Brodie crouched by the waiting shelter. Myrie Gunn stood with one hand pressed to her mouth. Beyond the chain gate, near the shelter door, lay Meredith Slate. There was no drama in the sight of her. That made it worse. She looked small in her dark, waterproof coat, one arm bent beneath her, hair loosened from its careful knot. Rain had slicked the folder beside her into a dark, swollen shape. The torch lay a few feet away, dead. Hamish went quiet inside. Death outdoors in bad weather always seemed a particular cruelty. The world did not pause. Rain continued to fall. Gulls still cried. Ropes still creaked. The Loch did not know what it had witnessed, or if it did, it kept its own counsel. Dr. Brodie stood. Exposure, likely. Perhaps a fall. I'll know more after the post-mortem. Was she here all night? Looks like. Myrie made a small sound. Cal said, "The gate was locked." Hamish looked at the chain gate. It was fastened across the access point from the slip, heavy chain looped through a post and secured with a padlock. Beyond it, the The shelter door hung half open. "Locked when you arrived?" "Aye," said Cal. "I had to unlock it." "With your key?" "Aye. Anyone else here?" "No," Archie said. "I came with him. We found it together." Hamish crouched near the padlock. Fresh oil gleamed along the hinge and under the shackle, a slick black smear made sharp by rain. He touched it with the tip of a twig and smelled it. "You oil this often?" Cal frowned. "No. Why not?" "It squeals." "That seems a reason to oil it." "It's a reason not to. Folk hear it if it's handled at night." Hamish looked at him. Cal's mouth tightened. "I did not touch it last night." From down the lane came the growl of a car driven too fast for wet gravel. Blair arrived, as if summoned by the chance to be loud near a body. He got out of the police car, sweating inside his coat, cigarette already in hand despite the rain. Behind him came Detective Jimmy Anderson, looking cold, resigned, and not yet sufficiently caffeinated. "What's this, then?" Blair barked. "Councilwoman gets herself frozen because none of you lot can run a boat." No one answered. Blair strode to the shelter, looked at the body, looked at the ferry, then looked around for someone to blame. "Where's Macbeth?" "Here," said Hamish. Blair turned. "Of course you are. Like midges on a corpse." "Aye, and just as welcome. What happened?" "We're finding out." Blair snorted smoke. "I'll tell you what happened. Local incompetence. She comes to inspect this floating coffin, finds God knows what, gets stranded because some half-wit locks a gate, and now the papers will have a dead auditor and a subsidised ferry in the same sentence." Myrie flinched. Blair saw it, and grew happier. "Or maybe it's murder. That'll be worse for you lot, but better for headlines." Hamish's eyes cooled. "Mind your feet." "What?" "You're standing in a possible scene." Blair looked down. His shoe was close to a muddy print near the shelter. He stepped aside with exaggerated patience. "Don't teach me my job, Macbeth. I'd need longer boots." Anderson coughed into his hand. Hamish turned back to Meredith's folder. It was damp through, but when he lifted it carefully, a corner of one inner page resisted the rain. Not dry exactly. Protected. The edge was less swollen than the rest, as though something had been folded there, or removed from there after being kept under cover. "What's that?" said Anderson. "Notebook page. Corner's odd." Blair loomed. "Odd how?" "Drier than it should be. She had a folder. The rest of it's wet." Blair looked irritated by the existence of details. Hamish opened the notebook with gloved fingers. The writing was blurred in places, but some lines remained legible. Passenger count inconsistent with submitted figures. Far slip access informal. "Speak to MG. Read trust room records. Check private complaints source." The next page corner was torn. Not ripped dramatically. Removed neatly enough, but in haste. Hamish closed the notebook. "Has anyone touched this?" Cal shook his head. Myrie whispered, "No." Lugs, who had padded over to the shelter, sniffed Meredith's dropped torch, then sneezed hard enough to offend himself. Blair glared at the dog. "Get that animal out of my scene." "He's got more delicacy than some officers," said Hamish. "Say that again." "No need." Everyone heard. For a moment, the rain seemed louder. Dr. Brodie stepped between them, brisk and irritated. "If you two have finished measuring antlers, there is a dead woman here." That did what dignity could not. Blair turned away first. Hamish looked across the loch. On the near side, Lochdoo was a smudge of pale walls and smoke. Between here and there lay water, routine, pride, and now death. Meredith Slate had come to decide whether the ferry should live. Now the ferry would be judged by her dying. Myrie Gunn stood with rain running down her face, though whether all of it was rain Hamish could not tell. "She'll close us from the grave," she said. "No," said Hamish. She looked at him. He had not meant to say it so firmly. "No," he repeated, softer. "We'll find what happened first." Cal's hand closed around the oily padlock key in his pocket. Blair shouted for photographs, statements, barriers, and someone to get him a coffee, as if volume created order. The ferry rocked gently beside the slip. Its engine was still warm. Chapter 5. Canteen Pie and Fisherman's Broth. The Strathbane police canteen served a pie that had plainly lost an argument with gravy. Hamish sat at a metal table across from Jimmy Anderson, watching Blair attack his lunch as though it had offended him personally. Rain beat against the high windows. Fluorescent lights turned everyone the colour of undercooked pastry. Lugs had been banned from the building after an incident involving a mop bucket, so he was outside in Angela Brodie's borrowed car, steaming up the windows and probably considering legal action. Blair pushed a forkful of pie into his mouth and spoke around it. "We close the ferry." Anderson looked up. "Do we? Public safety. Dead council auditor. Makes us look decisive. It also makes the village furious." "Good. Furious people talk." Hamish stirred tea that did not deserve the name. "Furious people lie too, especially if they think you've already chosen which one of them did it." Blair pointed his fork. "I've chosen nobody." "But have eyes. That deckhand lad McPhee. Mouth on him. Threatened sabotage in front of half the pub. He said a foolish thing." "Aye. Folk who say foolish things often do foolish things. And folk who say clever things never do." Blair scowled. Anderson turned to Hamish. "Post-mortem will be later today. Preliminary says exposure complicated by a head injury. She may have fallen." "Or been made to fall," said Blair. Hamish thought of the locked gate, the oiled padlock, the removed page corner. "Did her car turn up?" "At the lodge," said Anderson. "Parked neatly." "No sign she drove to the far slip." Blair grunted. "So she crossed." "No scheduled crossing," said Hamish. "Then someone took her. Maybe McPhee. Robbie doesn't run the ferry alone. He could take a dinghy." "In fog? At night? With Meredith Slate? You're very protective of this boy." "I'm protective of not being stupid early." Anderson looked into his tea to hide a smile. Blair's face reddened. "I'll remind you, Macbeth, you're a village copper with no car." "Aye," said Hamish. "And yet here I am ahead of you." It was not wise. But his socks had been wet for 2 days, and his temper had grown mildew. Blair shoved back his chair. "You interview your precious locals. I'll do the actual police work. That'll make a change." Blair left with his cigarette already between his lips. Anderson sighed. "You know he'll make your life miserable. He'll have to queue." By late afternoon, Hamish was back in Lochdoo, gratefully accepting a bowl of fisherman's broth from Archie McLean's sister, who fed half the village without admitting it. The broth tasted of haddock, potato, pepper, and competence. It restored his belief in food. Lugs lay under the kitchen table, chin on paws, waiting for disaster to fall from a spoon. Cal Mackay sat opposite Hamish, both hands wrapped round a mug. "I did not give her the key," he said for the 3rd time. "I heard you the first 2, she asked. "When?" "After the interviews. At the lodge. Said she wanted to check the gate." "And you said?" "I said no. Not alone at night." "Did she push?" "Aye. In that way folk do when they're used to being obeyed politely." "Who had?" "Myrie. Maybe Drummond. Robbie was in and out." "Myrie has a key?" Cal hesitated. "She has trust room keys. Not always the gate key." "That's a different answer." Cal's eyes lowered. "There's spares. One at the lodge reception for emergencies." Hamish waited. Cal rubbed his face. "It was done years ago, before Drummond bought the place. Guests sometimes got caught after walks. The lodge had a key, so they could open the chain gate." "And no one mentioned this to Meredith?" "Myrie would have, if asked proper." Meredith asked about spares. Cal looked miserable. "We didn't want it sounding careless." "So you made it sound secret." He said nothing. Hamish let the silence do its work. Later, he found Robbie McPhee behind the boat shed, kicking stones into a puddle with the fury of a man too young to know how to be afraid quietly. "Blair's looking for you," said Hamish. "Let him look. He'll enjoy that." Robbie's jaw tightened. "I never touched her." "I never said you did." "You're all thinking it." "I'm thinking you've a mouth like a loose gate in wind." The boy looked away. "She spoke to folk like we were dirt. She spoke to folk like they were figures. That's worse." Aye, sometimes. Robbie kicked another stone. She was asking about late crossings. Said someone had complained there were unrecorded trips. Said the ferry trust was cooking numbers. Who told her that? How would I know? You hear things. I hear folk saying my wages'll be gone. Mum's hours cut at the lodge. Cal blamed. Mary blamed. Everyone blamed except the folk who sit in nice rooms and call it viable. Hamish studied him. Under the anger was fear, and badly covered. Did Meredith ask you for the far slip key? Robbie laughed once. Me? She'd no ask me for the time, unless she could audit my watch. Did you see her after the pub? The boy's face changed. Aye. Where? Near the slip. When? Maybe 9. Maybe after. I went out for air. Because you were angry? Because if I stayed, I'd say more. And? She was by the shelter, near side, looking at the timetable. I thought she'd gone. Alone? I thought so. That means maybe not. Robbie rubbed his sleeve under his nose. I heard someone on the road. Fancy shoes on wet gravel. Fancy shoes sound different? In Lochdoo? Aye. Before Hamish could ask more, Myrie Gunn appeared at the edge of the shed, clutching her cloth bag. Hamish, I found the crossing logs. Her face was pale. Inside the Ferry Trust's back room, old receipts curled at the edges in the damp. A tin of spare bolts sat beside a kettle that had not been cleaned since devolution. The ticket rolls were kept in a drawer. The thistle punch hung from a hook on the wall. Hamish looked at the hook. Is that where it always is? Aye, said Myrie. Cal hangs it there. He lifted the punch. Its bent petal was there, familiar and faintly ridiculous. Myrie opened the logbook. No late crossing, she said. Nothing after the regular evening run. Who writes the log? Cal, mostly. Robbie sometimes, if Cal's busy. And tickets? Cal sells. Sometimes I help on fair days. Hamish turned the pages. The records were tidy enough to suggest Myrie's hand had rescued them often from Cal's. Passenger counts, weather notes, fuel, minor repairs, complaints. One recent entry had been underlined twice. Chain gate sticking. Cal says, leave it noisy. Hamish smiled faintly. Cal's a philosopher. He's stubborn. Often the same thing. Myrie did not smile. Will they close us? Not if I can help it. That is not an answer. It's the one I have. She sank into a chair. I have kept that ferry going with raffles, letters, favours, and lies, so small I told myself they were courtesy. Rounding passenger numbers. Logging a medical crossing as scheduled because the form had no box for mercy. If she had written us up, did she find that? I don't know. Did you give her the key? No. Her answer came too fast. Hamish said nothing. Myrie gripped the cloth bag. I did not give her the key. This time he believed that she believed it should be enough. As he left the trust room, Lugs, who had been dozing in the doorway, raised his head and thumped his tail once. A wet thud. Loyal, lazy, and useless in equal measure. Hamish scratched his ear. Come on. We've people lying for good reasons and bad ones. Lugs rose reluctantly. Outside, the ferry lay dark against the pier. The timetable flapped again under the shelter roof. A ferry, Hamish thought, was a simple thing only to those who had never needed one. Chapter 6. The ticket that shouldn't exist. The next morning brought weak sun, which in Lochdoo meant the rain had moved a few hills over to gather strength. The ferry trust room smelled of damp paper, old tea, engine oil, and the faint despair of voluntary committees. Hamish stood at the table, with Myrie Gunn's records spread before him. Cal Mackay leaned against the wall with his arms folded. Robbie McPhee hovered by the door, pretending he did not care what happened. Lugs slept in the patch of sunlight beneath the window, twitching occasionally, as if chasing a more competent investigation in his dreams. Blair had sent word that Robbie was to present himself for formal questioning in Strathbane. Hamish had sent word back that Robbie was a minor, his mother had not been properly notified, and Blair could wait until he had finished discovering whether his theory had legs. Blair had replied by telephone in terms unsuitable for church. Hamish had hung up. "Show me the ticket drawer," he said. Myrie unlocked a metal cabinet. Inside were rolls of orange ferry tickets, receipt books, spare pencils, a cracked mug full of paper clips, and a packet of digestive biscuits that had gone soft but not been abandoned. "Anyone can get into this?" "No. Only key holders." "Who?" "Me. Cal, the treasurer, but he's in Glasgow with his daughter. There's an emergency key at Patel's shop in a sealed envelope." "Sealed?" "It was." Hamish looked at her. "I'll check." Cal shifted. "You thinking someone made a ticket?" "I'm thinking Meredith Slate had reason to believe something happened after the regular crossing. She was wrong. Dead folk can be wrong." "It's not our first hope," Robbie said from the door. "Blair thinks I did it." "Blair thinks smoke is an investigative technique," said Hamish. Myrie made a small, disapproving sound, but her mouth twitched. Hamish opened Meredith's notebook, now dried carefully page by page in the station with the help of Angela Brodie's airing rack and a warning never to tell her husband. A folded item had been found tucked between the pages. A ferry ticket. Even dried, it held the limpness of paper that had known rain. The date was yesterday's. The printed time corresponded to the evening crossing. In one corner was the punched thistle. Hamish held it near the window. There it was. The tiny, uneven notch from the bent petal. Click. A dull routine mark. A proof of passage. Cal stared at it. "No. You recognise it? It's Orse. Could it be from an earlier ticket? The date's printed when torn." That roll was current. Myrie sat down. Robbie came forward despite himself. "That means she crossed." Cal rounded on him. "No. It means someone wants folk to think she crossed." "Maybe you forgot," Robbie said. Cal's eyes flashed. "I don't forget crossings. You forget plenty else. Not that." Hamish placed the ticket on the table. "Cal, did you run any late crossing?" "No." "Robbie?" "No." "Mary?" Her voice was thin. "I don't pilot the ferry." "Did anyone ask to use it?" "No." "Did anyone borrow the punch?" Cal barked a laugh. "Borrow a ticket punch? You'd be surprised what murder makes useful." Myrie's face tightened at the word. Robbie said, "So, someone got in here?" "Maybe." "Who?" "That's the popular question." Hamish inspected the ticket roll. The next ticket number followed normally from the previous day's recorded sales, but one ticket had been removed from the roll between entries. Not enough to upset the count unless one knew where to look. Myrie saw it as soon as he did. "Oh, are ye? I should have noticed. You were busy keeping a ferry alive with biscuits and guilt." She looked away. Cal came to the table, took the thistle punch, and pressed it onto a scrap. Click. He compared the hole to the ticket. Same. His voice carried anger now, but not guilt. There was injury in it. Someone had used his small, battered system to make a liar of him. Robbie swallowed. If it was not Cal, and not me, Hamish folded the ticket into an evidence sleeve, then someone had access to the trust room, or to the punch when it was out of it, Myrie said. "At the lodge yesterday. Meredith asked to see it. She handled it," said Cal. "Then gave it back. Anyone else?" "Half the room saw it." "Seeing is not taking," Robbie said. "Drummond was there." Myrie frowned. "Mr. Drummond does not need to steal ticket punches." "No," said Hamish. "That may be why no one would watch his hands." The door opened. Nessie Curry put her head in. "Hamish Macbeth. Blair is at Patel's, saying he'll drag Robbie to Strathbane by the ear if need be." Jessie's head appeared below hers. "Not literally, I think," Nessie said. "It sounded literal." Robbie's face drained. Cal stepped forward. "He'll not touch the boy." "Cal," said Hamish. "I mean it. So does Blair, when there's an audience." Myrie stood, but Hamish lifted a hand. "Robbie, go home." The boy stared. "What?" "Go home. Stay there. Do not go near the slip. Do not argue with Blair. Do not be seen looking dramatic by water. I'm not hiding." "I did not say hide." "You just said stay home." That is not hiding. That is denying Blair Theatre. Robbie's face hardened. He heard only what fear translated. Fine. He pushed past Nessie and Jessie and ran down the lane. Nessie watched him go. That looked like hiding. Hamish closed his eyes briefly. Mrs. Curry, I am only saying how it will look. Aye, said Hamish. That's the trouble with Lochdoo. It never runs out of eyes. Jessie said softly, nor tongues. Hamish looked at the ticket again. The little bent-petal notch seemed almost comic. A tiny flaw. A little thistle wound. Enough, perhaps, to cross a loch in the dark without ever stepping on the boat. Chapter 7. Hamish's Mistake. By lunchtime the story had changed 3 times and improved in cruelty each time. In Patel's shop, where all news came to be priced, wrapped and corrected, Robbie McPhee had gone from sent home by Hamish to told to keep out of sight to hidden away because police know more than they're saying. By 12:30, Jessie Curry had heard that Robbie had been seen washing oil from his hands behind the boat shed. He was eating a bridie, said Mr. Patel from behind the counter. Nessie looked disappointed. With oily hands, perhaps. With bridie hands, said Mr. Patel. Which are more common? The shop smelled of oranges, paraffin, fresh rolls, and damp coats. A line had formed not because people needed things, but because being in a queue gave gossip moral cover. Fiona McPhee stood near the bread shelf, holding a loaf she had squeezed without knowing it. Hamish saw the marks of her fingers in the plastic. He had walked there in a mood made worse by sun. Somehow rain suited trouble. Sunshine made people's sharpness look voluntary. Lugs had followed him as far as the shop doorway, then collapsed across the threshold. Customers stepped round him with the resigned agility of folk long trained by animals and weather. "Morning," said Hamish. Nobody answered normally. That was how he knew he had made a mistake. Blair stood by the counter with a cigarette unlit between his fingers, prevented from lighting it only by Mrs. Patel's expression. He was flushed from irritation and pleased with the crowd. "Macbeth," he said. "Where's the boy?" "At home." "There we are." Blair turned to the shop. "At home. Hiding." Fiona's face went white. "He is not hiding." Blair looked at her. "And you are?" "His mother." "Then you'll know where he was last night." "At home. After the pub." "After what time?" "I don't know exact." "No. Mothers often don't when sons are trouble." The loaf in Fiona's hand bent. Hamish's voice stayed mild. "That'll do." Blair turned slowly. "What?" "I said that'll do. You don't tell me when to stop questioning." "I do when you're questioning a woman beside the bread like a drunk preacher." The shop went so quiet Hamish could hear the refrigerator's hum. Blair stepped closer. "You're obstructing." "I'm observing." "You told a suspect to stay away from the scene." "I told a frightened boy not to feed your appetite for display." Blair's eyes gleamed. "So he is frightened." "Most folk are frightened when a man twice their size starts shouting murder before evidence," Fiona whispered. "Robbie did not hurt her." Nessie Curry looked at the floor. Jessie's eyes filled unexpectedly with tears, which irritated her. Mr. Patel placed a packet of tea on the counter very carefully. "Inspector, perhaps formal matters should be at the station." Blair wheeled on him. "Perhaps shopkeepers should sell beans and leave policing to police." Mrs. Patel, who had emerged silently from the back room, said, "Beans are useful. Bullying is not." A small breath moved through the shop. Hamish did not smile, though he wanted to. Blair's colour deepened. "This is not over." "No," said Hamish. "But this part is." Blair stormed out, nearly stepping on Lugs, who did not move. The dog opened one eye and looked at him with profound administrative contempt. When the door closed, the shop exhaled. Fiona put the loaf back on the shelf, though it was ruined. "I'll pay for that," she said. "No," said Mr. Patel. "It has suffered enough." A few people laughed softly. Not because it was funny enough, but because relief needed somewhere to go. Hamish touched Fiona's arm. "Robbie at home?" She nodded. "He thinks you told him to hide." "I did not. He's 17. They hear the injury, not the sentence. Aye. She looked at him then, not accusing exactly, but tired of needing powerful men to be careful. He has been blamed for things since he was 12. A broken window, a missing purse that turned up behind a cushion, a bicycle he never touched. Folk like a simple face for a simple story. Hamish felt the rebuke land where it should. I'm sorry. She looked away. That does not help him. No. From behind a stack of tinned peaches, Jessie Curry spoke in a voice smaller than usual. I heard the chain gate. Everyone turned. Nessie hissed. Jessie! Jessie's cheeks mottled. I thought I did. When? Asked Hamish. Last night. After Meredith Slate left the pub. I went out because Nessie said the air would help my indigestion. I did not say the alley, said Nessie. Jessie ignored her. I heard metal. Across the water, maybe. Or near. I don't know. Then steps. Whose steps? I couldn't say. Hamish waited. Jessie twisted her gloves. I won't have folk saying I saw what I didn't. Or blaming me for blaming them. It's not easy, being heard in this village. That, from a Curry sister, might have been comic on another day. Today, it was not. Nessie put a hand on Jessie's sleeve. Hamish softened his voice. You heard metal and steps. That's all. That's all. Will you tell Blair? Jessie's eyes widened in horror. No. Will you tell me properly later? She hesitated. Nessie said, She will. Jessie glared at her sister, but some of the fear had gone. Hamish left the shop with tea, bread, and a clearer understanding of his own foolishness. Outside, lugs rose with great reluctance. The sun had brightened the wet road. The village looked freshly washed, which was no guarantee of innocence. At the top of the lane, Alistair Drummond was helping an elderly guest into a lodge car. He laughed at something she said, charming as a postcard. His shoes were polished again. Hamish watched him turn, watch the shop, and smile. Not at anyone. At the scene. A man pleased by the shape of things. Hamish looked down at Lugs. I've been watching the wrong kind of anger. Lugs sneezed. Aye, said Hamish. Helpful as ever. Chapter 8. The easy culprit. By the afternoon, Blair had his story. It had a villain young enough to be disliked, angry enough to be believed, and poor enough to be handled roughly without anyone important objecting. Robbie McPhee had shouted about sabotage. Robbie had been seen near the ferry slip after Meredith left the pub. Robbie had avoided Blair. Robbie had once, at 13, taken a tin of travel sweets from Patel's shop and returned it unopened after his mother marched him back by the collar. In Blair's mind, these facts formed a bridge sturdy enough to drive a conviction across. In Hamish's mind, they formed a collection of wet planks. The slip was calm, under a pale sky. The ferry moved gently at its ropes. Cal Mackay worked in the engine housing with the grim concentration of a man who knew his boat's noises better than most husbands knew their wives' voices. Lugs lay in the sun outside the waiting shelter, blocking the timetable and accepting admiration from Ewan, who had brought his collection of punched ticket stubs in a biscuit tin. Can I show you? Ewan asked Hamish. Aye, but mind you don't let Lugs audit them. The boy opened the tin. Inside were dozens of ticket ends, each with the little thistle punch. Hamish crouched. They've all got the wee nick, said Ewan. So they do. Except this one. It's torn funny. Hamish looked. One stub was ripped at an angle and muddy at the edge. When did you get that? Yesterday morning. Mr. Mackay dropped it, and Lugs nearly ate it. Lugs has standards. Low ones. Ewan grinned. Hamish returned the stub. But the thought stayed with him. The punch mark was not merely decorative. It was a signature no one had meant to sign. Blair arrived with Anderson and 2 uniforms. Where's McPhee? He barked. At home, said Hamish. Still hiding? Still not providing you scenery. Blair ignored him and went to the boat shed. Inside, Robbie stood with his mother, Cal, and Mary. The boy's face was set hard, but his hands shook. Blair saw the shaking and smiled. Nervous? Angry, said Robbie. Same in the guilty. Same in the innocent, when idiots speak. Fiona closed her eyes. Blair stepped forward. You were seen at the slip. I told Hamish that. You argued with the victim. So did half the village. You talked about sinking the ferry. I talked rubbish in a pub. Then you disappeared. I went home. No one saw you. My mother did. Your mother would say she saw you flying if it kept you from a cell. Hamish moved before he thought about it. Not much. Just a step. But Blair noticed. You touch me, Macbeth, and you're finished. I was only coming closer to hear the quality of your reasoning. Anderson muttered. Gentlemen, Blair rounded on him. Don't you start. Hamish looked at Robbie. Did you have the trust room key? No. Ever? No. Did you have the ticket punch? No. Blair snapped. He could have taken it. When? Before. From a locked room. He could have stolen the key. Which key? The trust key. From whom? Blair glared. Hamish turned to Myrie. Was your trust room key missing? No. Cal? No. The sealed emergency key at Patel's? I checked, said Hamish. Envelope still sealed. Mrs. Patel enjoyed telling me so. Robbie's voice cracked. I told you. Blair jabbed a finger. You could still have lured her. Locked the gate. Left her. With what gate key? Said Hamish. The boy works there. On the ferry, not at the lodge. The Fargate spare was at lodge reception. Alistair Drummond, who had entered quietly enough for a large man, spoke from the doorway. Not freely available, constable. All turned. He wore another tweed jacket, darker today, and an expression of concerned authority. Our reception key cabinet is locked. Staff sign keys, in and out. May I see the log? Of course. Now, a small pause. If necessary, it is. Blair frowned. What's this got to do with MacPhee? Hamish did not answer. He had caught the scent before he saw the man. Alistair's aftershave reached the shed before him, smooth and woody and expensive. It stirred a memory. Meredith's notebook, the dry corner, a faint scent beneath damp paper that did not belong to Cal's oil, Robbie's cheap soap, or Myrie's lavender hand cream. Hamish looked at the evidence bag in his pocket. The dry page corner, protected in someone's pocket, perhaps. Someone whose scent clung to it. Mr. Drummond, he said. Did you speak privately to Meredith Slate after she left the pub? No. Did you give her a note? Alistair's brows rose. A note? About the far slip. No. Did you sign out the gate key? I don't involve myself in reception routine. That is not an answer. Alistair gave a polished sigh. Constable, I appreciate your local loyalties, but surely the simpler explanation is usually correct. Only if simple folk are doing the explaining. Myrie's hand went to her mouth again, this time to hide something like a smile. Blair, irritated by losing centre stage, said, Enough! MacPhee comes with us. No, said Hamish. Blair turned. No? The theory collapses. On your say-so? On timing and access. Robbie was seen near the near slip. Meredith died at the far slip. No late crossing was logged. The ferry ticket in her notebook was forged from the trust room or with trust equipment. Robbie had no key to the trust room, no gate key, and no way to produce that ticket without help you haven't found. I'll find it. You're not looking. The shed went very still. Blair's face turned dangerous. Hamish continued, mild as milk. And there's the scent. What scent? Expensive aftershave on the dry corner of Meredith's notebook page. Alistair laughed. It was a very small laugh, but it came too soon. Aftershave? Really, Constable. Aye. Ridiculous thing. Like wearing a dinner jacket to gutfish. Archie, who had appeared outside the shed, said, Waste of a dinner jacket. No one laughed loudly. The room was too tight. Alistair smiled again. I was near Miss Slate several times. So were many people. Not many in Lochdoo smell like a hotel bathroom pretending to be a forest. Robbie stared at Hamish. For the first time since Meredith's death, The boy looked less alone. Blair pointed at Alistair. "Are you accusing Mr. Drummond?" "I'm noticing him. That's not evidence." "No," said Hamish. "But it's better than appetite." Alistair's smile remained. But something behind it withdrew. "If you need the reception key log, I'll make it available. Thank you." "Anything for the community," said Alistair. Hamish watched him leave. There it was again. The phrase, smooth and empty. Anything for the community. A man could say that while shrinking the community to fit his own gait. Chapter 9. Sonsie's Thistle. That night, Hamish's cottage was colder inside than seemed reasonable. The heater had failed, with a smell of hot dust and defeat. Rain tapped at the window. The kettle sat on a borrowed camping stove, muttering towards a boil. His socks hung by the hearth, though the hearth held no fire, only the memory of one and a small heap of ash that refused to look useful. Lugs lay sprawled like an old hearth rug in front of the dead fireplace, snoring with the moral confidence of a creature who contributed nothing and expected gratitude. Hamish sat at the kitchen table, with the evidence spread before him. Copies of the ferry logs, Meredith's notes, the forged ticket, the list of key holders, the lodge reception sign-out sheet Alistair had provided after an hour's delay, and 2 phone calls. The sheet showed no far-slip key signed out on the night Meredith died, which meant either no one had taken it, or someone at the lodge had learned that records were most useful when clean. The back door scratched. Hamish looked up. The scratch came again, sharper. "Come in then, you weak criminal." Sonsie slipped through when he opened the door, a streak of wet wildcat attitude with eyes like green lamps. She carried something in her mouth. Not a mouse. Not a bird. Not, thankfully, part of a guest from the lodge. She dropped the object on the mat, sat back, and began washing one paw with theatrical unconcern. Hamish crouched. It was a small metal cap, dark, oily, ridged at the edge. At first he did not place it. Then he saw the tiny engraved curve of a thistle leaf. He went very still. The thistle ticket punch had a detachable handle cap. He had never noticed it until now, because no one notices the caps of tools they are not taking apart in secret. He picked it up with a cloth. Fresh oil slicked its edge. Lugs opened one eye, sneezed, and returned to sleep, as if detecting were a vulgar hobby. "Where did you get this?" Hamish asked Sonsie. Sonsie looked past him into the room, dismissing both question and questioner. I'll just put Wildcat declined interview in the report." He took the cap to the table and set it beside the forged ticket. The punch mark, with its bent petal, seemed to look back at him. Someone had handled the punch away from its proper place. Perhaps taken it apart because the mechanism stuck. Perhaps oiled it. Perhaps hurried. He pulled on his coat. Lugs remained where he was. "No, don't trouble yourself." The dog lifted his tail once in farewell. Outside, rain had eased to a fine mist. The village was dark except for a few lit windows. The Patel's upstairs lamp, the pub's back room, the Curry sisters' parlour where 2 silhouettes sat close over tea and talk. Hamish walked to the ferry trust room. The door was locked. He opened it with Myrie's spare key, borrowed that afternoon with her anxious permission. Inside, he switched on the light. The thistle punch hung on its hook. He took it down. The handle cap was missing. Not recently noticed because the tool still worked. Awkwardly, perhaps. But enough! He pressed it onto a scrap. Click. The thistle hole appeared. Uneven notch and all. He compared the metal cap from Sonsie with the handle. A match. Fresh oil marked the join. Hamish searched the drawer beneath. Ticket rolls. Receipt books. Soft biscuits. A small tin of oil with a rusted lid. He opened it. Nearly empty. Cal had said he did not oil the padlock because he wanted it to squeal, but someone had oiled the padlock. Someone had oiled the punch. Someone had wanted metal quiet and paper convincing. On the shelf above the ledger sat a stack of complaints sent to the council about the ferry. Late starts, safety concerns, blocked access, youths loitering. Unreliable staffing. Many were unsigned. Several had been printed on good paper. Hamish held one to the light. No signature, but a faint watermark from Lochside Lodge stationery showed at the corner. He smiled without pleasure. "Now then, Mr. Drummond." The back door creaked behind him. Hamish turned. Myrie Gunn stood there in a raincoat over her nightdress. Hair pinned badly, face pale. "I saw the light. You should be sleeping. So should you. I'm police. I'm chair of a ferry trust with a dead auditor. Neither of us chose peaceful work." Hamish held up the cap. "Do you know this?" She came closer. "The punch handle. Sonsie brought it to my cottage." Myrie blinked. "The cat? She's more honest than most witnesses. Though she charges in fish." Myrie touched the table for balance. "So someone took the punch." "Ah, yeah." Her voice dropped. "It was him, wasn't it?" Hamish did not pretend not to understand. "What makes you say that?" She sat down. "Because Meredith told me she had doubts about the complaints. She said they were too similar, too tidy. Real complaints ramble. These sounded like minutes from a meeting." "When did she tell you?" "After the interviews. At the lodge. She asked whether I trusted Mr. Drummond, and I said everyone trusts him." "That is not the same." "No," she said. "It is what frightened me." The rain ticked on the roof. Myrie folded her hands. "He has given jobs, donations, paid for the Christmas lights one year, helped when the school roof leaked. Folk are grateful. Then grateful becomes careful." Hamish thought of Alistair's smile. "Anything for the community." Did Meredith intend to close the ferry? Myrie looked up. "No, I don't think so." She said, "Closure might be the wrong question." She asked about public right-of-way enforcement at the far slip. Hamish felt the final piece turn. If the ferry stayed public, the lodge couldn't control access. No. And if it closed? Mr. Drummond could run his private launch. Guests only, booked access, premium experience. Her mouth twisted. He said it would raise standards. Whose? She did not answer. A noise came from outside. Both turned. Not the chain. Not rain. A footstep on gravel. Quickly withdrawn. Hamish crossed to the door and opened it. The lane was empty. Mist hung low. Across the way, the ferry shelter was dark. On the ground near the step was a trace of aftershave, impossible to see but present in the air. Myrie whispered, "Was someone there?" "Ah, yeah." "Who?" Hamish looked towards the lodge road. "Someone who still thinks Lochdoo can be managed if the paperwork is tidy enough." Chapter 10. The Ferry Trust Meeting. The emergency ferry trust meeting drew more people than Sunday service, and with less hope of salvation. The village hall smelled of damp coats, furniture, polish, tea, and biscuits that had been bought for ordinary disagreement and now seemed underqualified. Folding chairs filled in uneven rows. The committee table stood at the front, where Myrie Gunn had placed the ferry accounts, the crossing logs, and a vase of tired flowers, because no crisis in Lochdoo was allowed to occur without someone trying to make it presentable. Cal Mackay sat with his cap in his hands. Robbie McPhee sat beside his mother and stared at the floor. The Curry sisters sat front left, not because they were committee members, but because they had a civic relationship with information. Mrs. Wellington had brought her own cushion. Archie McLean leaned against the wall. "Mr. and Mrs." Patel stood at the back, having closed the shop for 20 minutes with a handwritten sign, "At Ferry Meeting. Back when sense returns." Lugs lay beneath Hamish's chair, sprawled like an old hearthrug, and snoring loudly enough to undermine democracy. Alistair Drummond arrived precisely 3 minutes late. It was the lateness of a man who wanted the room arranged before he entered it. He apologised with charm, took a seat near the aisle, and placed his gloves on his knee. Blair arrived 5 minutes later, which ruined the effect. He came in sweating, smelling of cigarette smoke and wet wool, with Anderson behind him and 2 uniforms at the door. He looked at the crowd and visibly enjoyed it. "Right," he said. "Nobody leaves until I say." Mrs. Patel murmured, "He thinks he is a weather system." Hamish stood. "This is a ferry trust meeting, Blair. It's a murder inquiry. It can be both. Lochdoo is economical. Blair pointed. You don't run this. No, said Hamish. Myrie does. Every head turned to Myrie Gunn. Her face tightened, but she stood. Thank you all for coming. We are here because the ferry's future has been questioned, and because Miss Meredith Slate died while investigating that future. Constable Macbeth has asked to go through the timeline. Blair barked. I did not approve. Hamish's voice remained gentle. You'll get credit later. It'll nourish you. A ripple moved through the room. Blair's eyes bulged, but Anderson touched his sleeve and murmured something. Blair folded his arms, choosing martyrdom. Hamish went to the front table. I'll not keep you longer than your discomfort requires. That could be hours, said Archie. Aye, but Mrs. Wellington brought a cushion, so standards have been raised. A few people smiled. It helped. Fear loosens better when it first laughs at itself. Hamish lifted the forged ticket in its sleeve. Meredith Slate had this in her notebook. A ferry ticket for the evening she died. Punched with a thistle punch. See here the wee bent petal leaves a notch. He passed it to Myrie, who held it up. The front rows leaned forward. Ewan, allowed to sit beside his grandmother, whispered, Same as mine. Aye, said Hamish. Same as all of them. Cal's voice was rough. I did not sell that ticket. No. Robbie looked up. And I didn't. No. Blair shifted, but held his tongue with visible suffering. Hamish placed the ticket down. The ferry log says no late crossing. Cal says no late crossing. Robbie says no late crossing. The ferry engine was not run after the regular evening service, yet someone wanted Meredith Slate to appear as though she had crossed legitimately. Nessie Curry said, Why? To make the ferry look reckless. To make Cal look careless. To make Robbie look guilty if a guilty face was needed. And to make Meredith's death seem like the result of Lochdoo's own messy ways. Fiona McPhee's hand closed over Robbie's. Hamish looked around the room, and many of us were ready enough to believe it. That hurt more because he included himself. Jessie Curry lowered her eyes. Hamish lifted the small metal cap. This came from the ferry punch. Sonsie brought it to my cottage. Mrs. Wellington said, The wildcat? Ah, yeah. Is that admissible? Only morally. Archie coughed. Hamish continued. The cap was freshly oiled. The padlock at the far slip was freshly oiled too. Cal had not oiled either. In fact, Cal liked the padlock loud. He wanted folk to hear it handled at night. Cal nodded once. Someone took the punch, or used it secretly. Someone created the false ticket. Someone had access to the far slip key. Someone also had access to Meredith Slate at the lodge, because a torn corner from her notebook was kept dry in someone's pocket and carried a scent. Blair could not help himself. Aftershave, is it? We're solving murder by perfume now? Hamish looked at him. Sometimes vanity is kinder to us than fingerprints. A murmur passed through the hall. Alistair Drummond smiled faintly. This is colourful, Constable, but rather speculative. It was, said Hamish. Until Myrie told me Meredith had changed direction. Myrie stiffened. Alistair's smile paused. Hamish did not look away from him. Miss Slate had been sent to review viability. Many folk believed she would recommend closure. Some feared she would expose the ferry trust's informal arrangements, medical trips logged awkwardly, passenger counts rounded in hope rather than fraud. But Meredith noticed something else. The complaints against the ferry were too tidy, too consistent, too useful to one argument. He lifted a sheet of paper. Several anonymous complaints were printed on paper from Lochside Lodge stationery. Alistair laughed softly. My office paper is used by staff, guests, charities. Aye. Generosity makes excellent cover. The room shifted. Hamish went on. Miss Slate intended to recommend that the ferry remain public, with proper oversight, and that access at the far slip be protected as a public right-of-way. That would have limited the lodge's ability to control the Lochside. Alistair's voice cooled. You are far outside your expertise. I often am. It gives me room to look about. Blair snapped. Get to it, Macbeth! Hamish turned on him. I am getting to it. Try not to arrive late in your own thoughts. There was a gasp, then silence. Blair's face darkened. He took a step towards Robbie's row. This whole pantomime is to protect that wee thug. Hamish's voice changed. Not louder, lower, softer, sibilant as wind through grass. You will not call that boy a thug in front of his mother again. Blair stopped. The room felt the steel under the mildness. Fiona McPhee bowed her head. Robbie's mouth trembled once before he pressed it flat. Hamish turned back to Alistair. Here is what happened. Meredith Slate was lured to the far slip by a note promising private evidence about ferry safety. The torn corner in her notebook once held that note. Someone protected it from rain, then removed it after she died. She did not drive there. Her car remained at the lodge. She crossed because someone made arrangements or persuaded her she would be met. Alistair said, By whom? By a respectable man she had no reason to fear. The hall held its breath in human terms, though Hamish would never have put it so fancifully. The far slip chain gate was locked from outside. The padlock was oiled to silence it. Meredith was trapped beyond easy shelter and help in fog and rain after a blow or fall. Then a forged ticket was placed in her notebook, suggesting she had used an evening crossing. That forged ticket was punched with the thistle punch from the trust room, Myrie whispered. But he did not have the trust room key. Hamish looked at her gently. He did yesterday at the lodge. She blinked. When Meredith asked to see the punch, Cal handed it over. Later, during the interviews, the punch sat on the table beside the coffee urn. Alistair Drummond stood there pouring coffee. A small tool can be pocketed by a man no one watches because everyone is watching the woman with the pen. Alistair's smile had gone. This is absurd. You returned it later? No. You returned it before anyone noticed, but the handle cap, oiled in haste, came loose. Sonsie found it near the lodge path. She steals what shines. That is your evidence? A cat and a smell? Hamish nodded to Anderson. Anderson stepped forward, holding a plastic evidence bag. And the lodge key log, he said. The original sheet was indented. The page above had been removed. We recovered an impression. Far slip key signed out at 8:47 p.m. Initials A.D. Alistair looked at him with sudden hatred. You had no right to read what you wrote, said Hamish. A terrible habit writing. Blair stared at Anderson. You knew this? Anderson said. Constable Macbeth asked me to check quietly. Blair looked as though betrayal had been invented for him personally. Hamish faced the room. Alistair Drummond wanted the ferry closed. Not because it failed Lochdoo, but because it succeeded too publicly. A council ferry meant public access, local control, people coming and going without booking through his lodge. A closed ferry meant private launch, exclusive Loch access, higher rates, fewer locals near guests who had paid for curated solitude. Nessie Curry's voice cut through. You wanted to make us smaller. Alistair's eyes flicked to her. You make yourselves small by clinging to sentiment. There it was. Not confession. Not yet. But the mask had slipped enough for the room to see the face beneath it. Myrie stood. We trusted you. No, said Alistair. You use me. Jobs, donations, repairs. Every time something broke, you came with your hands out. And then you complain when someone with competence suggests improvement. Cal rose slowly. Improvement? A launch service would be safer. For your guests. For people who value standards. Robbie said. Not us, then. Alistair looked at him. You were always going to be blamed, because you have spent years teaching people what to expect. Fiona made a small, wounded sound. That was the sentence that broke the room's last uncertainty. Hamish stepped aside as Anderson moved forward. Alistair Drummond, Anderson said. Bunkers, I am arresting you on suspicion of the murder of Meredith Slate. Alistair did not struggle. Men like him often mistook restraint for dignity until handcuffs corrected them. As Anderson led him out, Blair followed, loudly announcing procedural points he had not contributed to discovering. At the door, Alistair turned once. "You'll regret keeping that ferry. It will bleed you dry." Myrie Gunn, who looked suddenly older and steadier, said, "Perhaps. But it will be our blood." The door closed behind him. No one cheered. A cheer would have been easier. Instead, the village sat with what it had nearly done to Robbie McPhee, and with the knowledge that pride had made them quick to sacrifice the person already marked for sacrifice. Luggs woke, yawned, and put his head on Hamish's boot. Hamish looked down. "Aye," he said quietly. "That's about the size of it." Chapter 11. The Loch still crosses. The next morning was clear and cold. The kind of morning that made every wet roof shine and every old grievance look, if not forgiven, at least less eager for performance. The Loch lay bright under a pale sky. Gulls shouted over the slip as if nothing had happened that required lowered voices. The ferry ran at 8. Cal Mackay stood by the gangplank with the thistle punch in hand. Its handle cap had been replaced with a screw from Archie's shed, and a wrap of black tape that made it uglier and somehow more trustworthy. The bent petal still made its tiny, uneven notch. Click! 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 People queued with mugs of tea, shopping bags, work boots, school satchels, and the careful manners of those who had behaved badly and were not yet sure how to repair it. Fiona McPhee stood beside Robbie near the shelter. No one stared directly at them. That was meant kindly, though it made things awkward. Mrs. Wellington approached first. She held out a paper bag. "I made shortbread." Robbie looked at it as if it might explode. "For me? For whoever eats it." "I am not assigning blame to biscuits." He took it. "Thank you." Mrs. Wellington nodded, fierce with embarrassment, and moved away. Jessie Curry came next. "I should have spoken sooner about the chain." Robbie looked at his boots. "Are ye?" Nessie inhaled sharply, but Jessie held up a hand. "No, Nessie. Let him have his eye." Robbie looked at her then. Jessie's eyes were wet. "I am sorry." He nodded once. It was not forgiveness. Not yet. But it was a place where forgiveness might later stand. Myrie Gunn arrived with a folder under one arm and hair pinned properly again. She had spent half the night on the telephone with council officers, speaking in a voice that had begun polite and ended immovable. Emergency funding had been promised. Oversight would be tightened. Forms would multiply. The ferry would continue. "Forms," Cal said bitterly. "Forms," Myrie agreed. "And money," Cal considered. "I can learn to love forms in moderation." "No, you can't." "No." They smiled at each other, tired and real. Hamish came down the lane on foot, because his police car had not returned, and the universe had a taste for repetition. Luggs trotted beside him until he saw the gangplank, at which point he slowed to a statesmanlike crawl. Sonsie sat on a post near the pier, tail wrapped around her paws, watching the village with predatory stillness. If she felt pride in her contribution, she hid it beneath contempt. Blair arrived late, as expected. He came in a police car, stepped out, lit a cigarette, and announced to no one in particular that Strathbane CID had moved swiftly once certain information had reached the proper channels. "No doubt," said Archie. "Amazing how fast water flows downhill." Blair ignored him. He found Hamish near the shelter. "You were lucky." "Aye," said Hamish. "Cats, dogs, and women with key logs. A man can only be grateful." Blair squinted at him. "I'll be mentioning your irregular methods. I'll be mentioning your regular ones." There was a pause. Blair threw his cigarette into a puddle and stalked away to look important near the ferry. Hamish watched him go without satisfaction. Blair would always find another scene to stand in, another person to shout at, another report in which his name appeared larger than his usefulness. There were forces in the world no village constable could reform. Midges, weather, Blair. Cal had replaced the far slip padlock. He showed Hamish the new one when the ferry crossed. It was large, plain, and when Cal opened it, it produced a magnificent metallic squeal. "Good," said Hamish. "Folk will hear that in Ullapool. Then oil it never. That's the plan." The ferry bumped gently into the far slip. Passengers stepped off. The shelter door had been fixed. The timetable had been straightened. though someone had already written beneath it in pencil, subject to weather, forms, and common sense. Hamish suspected Mrs. Patel. Robbie lingered on deck, looking across the loch towards Lochdoo. "She'll never be just a ferry now," he said. "No," said Hamish. "Folk will remember." "Ah, yeah. Good or bad?" "Both." "That's usually how remembering works." Robbie nodded. After a moment, he said, "I did steal those travel sweets when I was 13. I know. I brought them back. I know. Folk remember the stealing longer than the bringing back." Hamish leaned on the rail. "Then make them tired of being wrong." Robbie glanced at him. "That your advice?" "It's all I have before breakfast." The boy smiled faintly. On the return crossing, Lugs finally stepped onto the ferry without bribery. He did it slowly, with a sigh so deep it suggested the ferry's survival was a concession he had personally granted. Ewan applauded. Lugs accepted the applause as overdue. Sonsie did not board. She watched from the pier until the ferry moved out, then vanished behind the shelter with the suddenness of a rumour. The loch glittered. Lochdoo waited on the other side. Untidy, proud, ashamed, relieved, alive, Hamish looked at the punch ticket in his hand. The bent thistle petal had left its little notch, as always. A flaw repeated faithfully. A mistake could become a mark. A mark could become proof. And proof, if followed without fear or favour, could bring a village back across from the wrong side of itself. The ferry kept moving. Not grandly, not perfectly, but steadily enough. Lochdoo kept its ferry, but it lost a little comfort in the idea that people always look after their own. For a while after Meredith Slate's death, folk spoke more quietly in the waiting shelter. Not because they had nothing to say Lochdoo would never come to that, but because some of them had heard their own voices choosing the easiest target. Shame, when it is honest, does not shout. It sits beside you and waits to be understood. That crooked thistle punch had been meant for dull routine. A small click. A torn ticket. Proof you belonged on the boat like everyone else. But the bent petal became the truth marker, because the smallest flaw can travel farther than any speech. When people feel judged by the outside world, they sometimes start judging each other first, just to feel in control. Pride can keep a place alive. It can also make it cruel when it is frightened. Still, kettles boil, tickets are punched. Someone will always offer half a biscuit without making a show of it. In the Highlands, kindness returns the way the tide does, quietly, steadily, and right when it means to. So let me ask you this. If you had to choose, which would you rather? Lose your pride or your place in the world? Thank you for coming back to Lochdoo with me for When the Ferry Didn't Come. If this case left you thinking of small communities, old routines, and the quiet harm of blaming the easiest person in the room, then the ferry has done its work. And when everyone blames the usual troublemaker, Hamish follows a crooked thistle mark to the truth.